Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November session of the Ask Thrive Live series. This month, we are going to dive into gratitude and resilience. As always, my name is Tara from the customer success team here at Thrive, and I want to welcome you with us today. Before we begin and welcome our wonderful guests that we have lined up for you, I wanted to remind you that we love to incorporate your live questions into these sessions. So please feel free, use the Q&A feature, use the chat box throughout. And also we have something exciting at the end of the session. We're going to do a book giveaway, something that we've never done before. So please stick around for that. And on to our guest. Today, we are honored to have two fabulous guests with us. First being Allison Gilbert. Allison is an Emmy award-winning journalist and one of the most influential writers and speakers on how to find the inner resources to overcome life's biggest challenges. She is the co-author of The Joy of Connections, which is the book that will be in our giveaway later. It's 100 Ways to Beat Loneliness and Live Happier and a More Meaningful Life, with the world-renowned therapist, Dr. Ruth Winsmeyer. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Allison.
It is such an honor. Thank you so much.
Of course. We are also welcomed by Thrive Global's senior content writer. Some of you may know her. If you do, you love her, Elaine Lipworth. She is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster who has reported for a variety of BBC shows and other networks. She's written about film, psychology, and health for newspapers and magazines around the globe. Elaine also taught journalism as an adjunct college professor. She's born and raised in the UK. She is a widow. Her husband died of brain cancer 3 years ago, and she has two daughters and lives in Los Angeles. So Elaine, thank you so much for being here to guide this conversation with us. And without further ado, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And it's a real honor to be here to talk to Allison about her wonderful new book, The Joy of Connections, and really what it means to connect. Allison, it's the time of year where connections are so important to all of us. You've experienced loss, you've written about loss, and you've written this wonderful book, which is by my bedside, with the late legendary Dr. Ruth. How did you actually meet Dr. Ruth and start working with her, and what's behind this book?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is just the highlight of my month. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I'm a journalist and I'm a grief-informed journalist. I lost both of my parents relatively young, got married without my mom, had my children without both of my parents by my side. And so I've become a working person, a human being in the adult sense without their support and their guidance. But all along, I've been using my journalism skills to explore stories that are really deeply meaningful to me. And among them is grief and loss and resilience and gratitude in the face of adversity. And so when I got this assignment from the New York Times to write a story about Dr. Ruth Westheimer's incredible pursuit to become the first loneliness ambassador in New York State, in the United States, I jumped at the chance to report that story, and she was successful. Late last year, Dr. Ruth Westheimer became the country's first ambassador to loneliness, something that's based on what happens actually in the UK. So it was an honor to write that story for the Times.
Well, Alison, loneliness is something we all face, and especially after grief, but really throughout our lives at different times. And we all experience loss. As Sarah mentioned in the intro, I lost my husband 3 years ago. And what I found, and I don't know if anybody else listening can identify, that when you go through extreme loss like that, gratitude and connection are a bit hard to think about because it's a matter of survival. How am I going to get through the minute and the day? So before we get on to all the tips, the micro steps, and the things that we can all do to connect, when we're lonely and when we're grieving, or however it is that we need to connect more. What would you say to begin with needs to happen for anybody who has gone through any kind of loss, whether it's the death of a spouse or a friend, or if you've been a caregiver?
I love the question. And if anyone told me when I was in my young 20s that I should have gratitude in my life when both of my parents were ill and then dying and then have passed away, I would have been actually really resentful and really angry because in my young adulthood, that was actually an abnormal experience to lose your parents so young. So gratitude would not have been a word that I would have embraced in that moment. But let me tell you what I've learned since then. We are never grateful for the loss, but what we can learn to nurture is gratitude that we can make meaning of the loss after a death. So how we keep the memory of a loved one's memory alive, how we wish to move forward to tell stories, to keep the name of our loved one top to our lips so we say their name out loud. So it's not gratitude ever for the death, it's gratitude to make meaning. And that's just the gift that is hard to learn at the time, but it's something that we can nurture.
Can you explain a little more about that? In fact, can you kind of give us an idea of what tips and what we can do to focus on gratitude if we're feeling lonely or disconnected, or if we've been through loss? Because especially at this time of year, I think it's something that's on everybody's minds. Gratitude is so important, but sometimes it's hard to be grateful for getting up in the morning, going about our jobs, our friends. So what methods do you have? What tools do you have, or micro steps as we call them, to do that, to tap into simple gratitude?
Well, listen, my favorite word when it comes to this conversation is the word and, A-N-D. The idea of moving forward and distancing yourself from your loss actually fills many of us with pain because that means we're not actually valuing our relationship. If we somehow feel that the only way forward is to remove ourselves from our recollections, from looking at photographs potentially, hearing music that might tap into a wonderful memory, that actually creates more space for feeling alone. Resilience, when we talk about that in context of grief, if you look at the definition, which I love, it's successfully adapting to difficult life experiences. It is not forgetting, it's adapting, which commingles with that word and. So a micro step is to acknowledge that part of the work of moving forward in a way that makes us feel whole is to not forget, to not distance ourselves from memories, but to actually embrace them, to talk about our loved one, to even bring their name up in conversation, especially during the holidays, because that acknowledges and validates the love that we've lost and the love we still have.
Yes, I mean, I find myself actually talking to my husband, Stephen, what shall I do? I don't feel great today. I'm so grateful that you were in my life for all those years. So we can do a number of things to focus on gratitude without dwelling on the pain of the loss as we move through grief.
Well, I
Okay.
would also say that gratitude can also be in the form of the loved ones who remain in our lives. So for me, again, I would never say that I was grateful that my mom and dad died, but over the years, I leaned into my relationship with my aunt, with my uncle, with my grandparents. Eventually, when I had children, my children, it's to look around you and not see life in absolutes, not to see life as black or white, but who remains, and to really pay attention to those blessings that you may overlook in times of acute pain. So it's trying to identify and being mindful of what you have still in the present tense that can bring you a sense of connection.
What you're really talking about is the deep connections that actually you talk about in the book with other people, with people on the street that we meet, with people in our daily lives, with co-workers and colleagues. How important are those connections to really getting through grief and moving on with life? And if you haven't experienced grief, how important is connection? I know that you actually have a menu for connection.
Well, Dr. Ruth Westheimer is this incredible sage when it comes to connections. For those of you who don't remember who Dr. Westheimer was, she died just this past July, but in the 1980s, she shot to fame as one of the world's most famous sex therapists. And late in life, at 95, when I wrote that article for the New York Times, she pivoted to wanting to discuss the loneliness epidemic. We know that being lonely, a lack of social connections, this feeling of being unmoored, untethered, not connected to people around us, can actually be as dangerous to our health as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So it impacts our mortality. It increases our risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, anxiety, depression. I mean, the list goes on. We are social animals. We are not meant to go through life in silos. And so when Dr. Ruth and I were writing The Joy of Connections, we developed together this Dr. Ruth's menu for connection. And there are multiple components. There is family, there's friends and lovers, because of course Dr. Ruth was a sex therapist, so she wanted to address our romantic relationships. And it's also really important to share that when you look at this chart, the largest component, one that's more important than community, more important than technology, is self. Your relationship to who you are and how you are in the world is more important than anything. Oh, yes, there it is.
Thank you. I was going
All the
to ask Clara for the menu. Now, this I found really fascinating, that of course, family and friends and people in stores and neighbors are important. But according to Dr. Ruth, and actually according to a great deal of science, the most important connection we can have is the connection with ourselves. And I'd love you to share a little more about this, Alison, because what exactly does that mean? So here we are, I live alone now. And if I was to try and imagine connecting with myself, I know that connecting with myself does not mean sitting glued to the TV, glued to whatever Netflix series I want to watch day after day, or politics. It involves a deep inner connection, which might be meditating, mindfulness. And what I think is so interesting is that until we really have a deep and loving connection with ourselves, it's very hard to have very deep connections with other people. And for me, what I'd love you to talk about is, how do you get that self-love that comes with connecting with yourself?
Well, I want to back up a little bit in case anyone here who is on this call today feels that we're kind of going into woo-woo territory. What Dr. Ruth was actually talking about, if you know Dr. Ruth, she was all about tough love. She did not mince words. She was unapologetic, and she really wanted people to understand their own role in their ability to move forward, whether or not it's with friendships or with our romantic partnership. So what she would say, and this is sometimes hard to hear, what is it about your own behavior? What is it about how you are in the world that might be causing rifts? What is it about how you relate to other people, what you say, what you don't say, your posture, how welcoming you are, how many times you actually have outbound communication with people as opposed to waiting for people to reach out to you? So if you look at your own behavior, which is kind of tough love, it's not easy. If we're honest with ourselves, if we look in the mirror, figuratively or in reality, you might get an understanding of why you might be having trouble forging, maintaining, and nurturing connections. So that's what Dr. Ruth really means by self. It's kind of owning up to your own role in connections. So we can kind
Yes,
of,
and by doing that, I mean, there are
yeah.
small ways, aren't there, to do that, which you talk about in the book, Dr. Ruth, and you talk about in the book, that are really tiny, that you can smile more, you can stop and say hi to a neighbor, you can talk to somebody else who's a pet owner if you're out with your dog, you can chat to the person in the grocery store and really change your behavior in very small ways with micro steps.
Well, this is so interesting. So there are micro steps that I would love to relate to you, but let me go back to the conversation just for a brief moment about resilience. Resilience is not something that you are born with. It's like you can cultivate it, you can practice it. And one way, one surefire way of cultivating it and nurturing and practicing your ability to be more resilient is to how you view and engage with the world around you, which is, of course, up to you. That's a part of self. How do you view the world? How do you engage with the world? So here's one example as a micro step. This is really great, by the way, if you're an introvert, because sometimes just telling someone, go talk to people, make friends, that kind of feels like, are you out of your mind? So one micro step could be being curious about somebody else, pausing long enough to stop sharing what's important to you and realizing other people have passions and priorities and hobbies and families, and to pause long enough to ask them how things are going. That's just one micro step, is being curious. Can I go on? Can I give you some more?
No, and being curious, listening to the other person, but please do.
Yes. Ask a question. If you're an introvert and you actually don't really enjoy talking and chatting, lob a question and just listen. That actually makes somebody else feel really important. I will tell you this, it's just a quick story. When I was interviewing Dr. Ruth Westheimer and getting all the information down for this book, she would always ask me a question at the end of every time that I was with her. It was an intense year writing this book with her, and she would say, "When will I see you again?" It's such a powerful question because to me it communicates so much. She wanted to see me again. And of course, that made me feel special. And she was not being passive about it either. She was not going to wait for her phone to ring. Before I could leave, I had to assign my name to a date on her calendar with a time. She was not going to leave it up to chance. And so there is that proactivity piece that is so important too. So be curious, make plans, be proactive. And another step I wanted to just relay as a micro step is lose count. If you are in the process of thinking that that friendship is no longer worthwhile because you do more of the inviting and that friend of yours never reciprocates and you're kind of exhausted by having to be the one to always reach out, your goal at the end of the day is not reciprocity. Your goal at the end of the day is to lose count and use this time to be with somebody who you care about. You are never going to know why somebody else doesn't want to be a host. And if they come every time that you invite them, maybe that is their way of showing up in your relationship.
So that sounds kind of challenging to me in terms of, are you saying that we need to have strong boundaries and choose people where there is reciprocity, so where there's give and take in a relationship, and maybe let go sometimes of connections that aren't as powerful or meaningful, and where the other person isn't giving as much? I mean,
Well,
it's
actually, in this
difficult to do.
particular case, I'm saying if you're keeping a ledger I would say you're losing out. I would say if you are expecting reciprocity, at the end of the day, that tally is going to make you feel like you're on the losing end of that equation. Some people just like to host more, so run with that. But I would say too, if you're around people who complain all the time, Dr. Ruth Westheimer hated complainers. If you're around negativity and your circle of friends are bringing you down and you're not feeling that there's air and oxygen in your relationship, then you have the power to start cutting that out of your life and moving towards relationships that make you feel good and whole and complete.
So I think this is brilliant advice, because if it's not to do with who hosts the most dinner parties or who gives the most in any kind of material way, it's to do with the bond, the connection, the joy, and the love. And what I hear you saying is that positive connections will just bring us more joy. It's a kind of ripple effect.
And do not be a feather in the wind just because you've been friendly with someone for decades. If that relationship is no longer serving you, then guess what? It is up to you. Back to Dr. Ruth's menu for connection and self. You have the ultimate control over your next step. You need to be proactive. You need to make these decisions. And if that's figuring out who is actually in your life, who sees you, who values you, who makes you feel like you're living a richer existence, that is up to you to then nurture those connections and slowly, gradually cast off the ones that are not in your life that are bringing you joy and lift.
Have you got any specific guidelines or suggestions on how to do that? How to bring more positive connections into your life? And, maybe some people have those already. Maybe some people don't have strong boundaries in the way that I was talking about before. And I think all of us could really do with tips on how to strengthen our connections. Rather, there are the obvious ones: join a book club, play a sport, and those are actually, they can work. But anything else beyond that you would suggest?
Yeah, I have so many. Thank you. Because the joy of connections, we have 100 of them. So let me just give you just a few. One is depth over breadth. And here's what I mean by that. So you just mentioned, a book club. However, some people, not me, are in many book clubs, or they're in one book club, but then they also volunteer at a soup kitchen, and they also volunteer for their child's school, and then they also volunteer for their workplace Saturday park cleanup. So there's a lot going on, but you only are invested in that activity, let's say once a quarter, or maybe it's even less than that. So you see, you get really spread out. You have lots of different possibilities of meeting people, but the opportunity to make those connections deeper and more meaningful are harder. So what to do in this case? For example, choose one activity and go to that one activity, let's say, for example, every week, Wednesday night, 7 p.m. after work. What's going to happen is that you're going to see the same people again and again and again. And that's going to give you the opening to have richer and deeper conversations. Now, what's also really important is to choose that activity that means something to you. Do not choose an activity because it looks good on your CV or your resume. Choose an activity that actually you enjoy doing. If you don't like being outdoors, then the park cleanup is not going to resonate with you. If you don't like children, then reading at the local, nursery school or elementary school, that's not going to be powerful for you either. And therefore, here's the trick. You're not going to find like-minded people doing those activities either. So pick one, go deep, and make sure it's something that you're passionate about.
Yeah, so it's really about following your own intuition, because many of us have people saying you should do this or go and volunteer and do that. And if your heart sinks at the thought, that's probably a good clue. Don't do it. But I want to move on from that, because what you've been talking about in terms of volunteering has been scientifically proven to increase our feelings of well-being, connection, actually our health and our gratitude. They're kind of inextricably linked. How important would you say that giving back and volunteering is in terms of connection and gratitude? And I know that it is something as well that you and Dr. Ruth discuss in the book.
Well, it is incredibly important, but I want to say why. Because I think the why really exemplifies to all of us just the path that is best to take when it comes to fortifying our lives with connections. Many times when we are feeling isolated, many times when we're feeling lonely, our self-esteem, our sense of worth plummets. And what happens when you volunteer, what happens when you give back, is that it's no longer about you, it's about somebody else. You're actually seeing the impact of your time and your effort on somebody else's life, and that you're making improvements. And that in turn boosts that self-esteem that we were just talking about. So you feel better as you walk through this world. And when you feel better as you walk through this world, you're going to be more open to connections, because you will feel that you are worthy of them. We are all worthy of them. But if you don't feel like you are worthy of them, it makes it more difficult. So I'm so glad you brought that up. It's so important.
Alison, actually, I want to just add to that, that from my perspective, and my kids and my late husband would tell you, he was the giver backer. He was the volunteer, he volunteered for everybody. It was not me. I was working and I was a journalist and very busy.
Yes.
I had two kids to look after. But what I found that since he died, and I've been doing more giving back, whether it's for the Brain Tumor Association, my local hospital, or with neighbors and friends, that just like shopping for sitting with an elderly neighbor, which I do regularly. The thing that I've really noticed is the joy I get is so profound that it's become kind of selfish, that the giving back for me is I'm hopefully it's benefiting the other person or the organization as well, but it's me that really benefits because I have more joy, and you can feel it. It's direct. So I absolutely love the idea of doing volunteering, and it doesn't need to be in a huge way. If you've got kids and you're busy and you're working and you have a very hectic life.
I think what you're saying is so hard for some people to absorb and then execute. Because when you are feeling the most low, you retract and your world tends to get smaller. And you don't want to leave through that front door. But what you and I are suggesting, and what Dr. Ruth talked about in that self component in the joy of connections, your need for connection has to be more strong, has to be more forceful than your complacency to exist as is. You need to get yourself off the couch. And when you do, you will find in this conversation that we are exploring now about gratitude and giving back, bit by bit, step by step, these are micro steps. You will start feeling better about who you are, and that'll just keep fueling bigger and more promising connections. And
Absolutely.
that's a gift.
And it does build that inner strength, that resilience, and the joy. Well, we do have a question. So
Oh,
from
good.
Julia Oleshko, who's asked Alison, when did you decide to become a journalist, and what will your next book be about?
I love this question. I wanted to be a journalist ever since I was in grade school. You know, journalists, I don't know whether you would agree, Elaine, but journalists like to be nosy. They like to be busybodies. They like to know what's behind the curtain. And that is me. If you entice me to go somewhere that other people can't go, to talk to people that maybe other people don't get to talk to, I am all in. If you allow me to connect the dots in different ways, in new ways, that to me is just intoxicating. So I've known that I wanted to be a journalist in just my entire life. And I feel so blessed now to be able to use my skills to explore topics that I feel are so meaningful to me. First, of course, it was loss. I mentioned that I lost both of my parents, but even before that, I was caught up in the September 11th terrorist attacks here in New York. That's where I am. I'm really lucky to be alive. So many people didn't survive that day. And when that second tower collapsed, I was nearly killed. And so I was able to write about trauma. And so I feel like to be able to use my curiosity to now explore resilience, gratitude, loss, I just feel blessed and really honored.
Any books coming up? Anything that you're working on at the moment?
You know what? Dr. Ruth Westheimer just died in July. The book came out September, so just a few weeks after she passed away. Dr. Ruth Westheimer had a big, big celebrity aura, and I am just doing everything I can to take her final book. She died at 96. She had so much to say about this loneliness epidemic and how we can all find more connections. And I feel like that is my work now, is to spread her final book, her final lessons as far and wide as possible. And I hope everyone here picks up a copy of her final book. She had so much to share. And I will just say one thing. This woman was 4'7", but what she made up for in her energy in her lifetime to make us all feel seen, to make us all feel heard, is something that I feel so honored now to be a part of. And she knew what she was talking about. She was ripped from her family when she was just 10 years old during the Holocaust. She grew up in Germany, was taken by kinder transport to Switzerland. She never saw her family again. So she knows loneliness and spent an entire lifetime piecing back her family of choice, bit by bit, friend by friend. And we have a lot to learn because she lived a big life. And I'm really excited to be on this journey for her now.
Well, coming back to the book, and Dr. Ruth's really inspiring life, what I've learned is that, like Dr. Ruth, but not exactly like Dr. Ruth, we all, every single one of us, goes through suffering, goes through difficult times, along with the joy. But when the difficulties become extreme, which they do in different ways, I would say, for all of us, whether it's divorce, whether it's problems with the children, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's fear about the world, whatever it is, I wonder what you would say Dr. Ruth had to say, and you have to say about resilience. Is there a key? Is there other tiny things that we can do when we're faced with those kind of major challenges in our own way, just as Dr. Ruth was?
I love this question. So way back in 2010, there was this incredible study that was conducted by researchers in New York and researchers in California. And what they studied was the power of getting back up after we are knocked down for any cause, whether it's grief or something else. And what they have found, we've been talking about gratitude. We are not grateful for those setbacks or those losses, but here's what we can be grateful for. when we are hit with those roadblocks, that we know we survived them. And that when they come again, which they will, because what life exists without headwinds, we know we are more capable. So that fills us with the knowledge that we've got this. Number two, because we know we've got this, it builds our self-esteem. So we can stand a little taller. It's like if you have young kids and your toddler is just learning how to walk and they keep falling, well, guess what? When they eventually learn to walk, they will feel more confident and they will have greater self-esteem because they've mastered the art of walking. So you can master the art of living in just the same way. And the last thing I will say, and I think this is so important, so everyone lean in, listen to this. It gives you perspective. If you survive being fired, if you survive the loss of a spouse or a parent, guess what happens? The next catastrophe, the next loss, the next headwind may not seem so much harder than that was. You might have learned a thing or two about how to survive, about how to thrive, how to move forward. And so you can have your perspective be a little bit more colorful and less black and white. You can
Yeah.
look at life in its fullness as opposed to catastrophizing because you have survived it before. So it changes your perspective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that kind of naturally happens as well. And as what it needs work, but it does happen naturally. That the tendency to catastrophize because you've gone through something catastrophic diminishes, I would say. And so I think that's really interesting. We have Alison, another question from our
Yeah,
lovely
before you get to that question, can I just say one last thing? You asked me before about micro steps. One thing that I think is really important too, we talked about being curious, we talked about losing count, not just having a leisure before how many times you host and somebody else doesn't, but pay attention to your mental wealth. So many times in the workplace, we prioritize job title, salary, perhaps moving miles and miles from our friends and our family for that next job. What we argue in the joy of connections, those things are very important. We are all in a workspace environment. We want to succeed. But before you make that next move, just add one thing to your column. When you move for this new job, who is there? What friends will have your back if you sprain your ankle and you can't go grocery shopping? Who's going to be there to bring you groceries if for some reason you come down with the flu? It's just thinking about mental wealth and your connections, not more important, not less important, but just putting it on the list when you are evaluating what's important to you for your next career move.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice because it's that community might be an important factor to consider when you're writing down your list, even of what you want, the vision of what you
Listen,
want.
if you have no one to water your plants when you go on vacation, no matter how many friends you have online, if you have no one to change the cat litter when you go away for the weekend, you might want to consider how you are running your personal life versus your professional life, and just keep it in mind.
Yeah, so I've got some questions that I'd
Hey,
love to get
good. Bring
to if
them
we've
on.
got time. So I'll go with the first one. I lost my mom in 2020 and have seen the way grief has fundamentally changed me as a person. Alison, do you have any advice for someone who feels like they're meeting themselves for the first time post grief?
I am so sorry you lost your mom. I feel like I'm meeting myself anew every day as I get older. Because as I approach the age my mom was when she died, which is now just a few years away, I'm understanding her differently. I'm understanding her and our relationship in a unique pattern. And so keep your eyes open. You are, of course, evolving and changing. And because of that, your relationship with your mom has the opportunity to evolve too. And I have found that to be incredibly healing. I feel like in some ways, I know and appreciate my mom now more than when she was alive. And I know that sounds strange, but I've worked hard at keeping this relationship alive by telling my children stories about their grandma. And it's not their grandma who was, it is their grandma. Is, present tense, no matter what, she is their grandma. And so I keep her alive, making sure they know stories, making sure they understand the character traits that I feel that they have inherited from her. And so I love your question. And so keep her present. I think you're doing, it sounds like just from your question, a great job.
And as Alison did with her mum's fruit pie.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can get have another question here.
Oh, I see Yulia. I see you, Yulia. Thank you so much. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you.
So this is somebody anonymous. And I think this question is really important. What if connecting with others makes you exhausted? Am I okay with being minimally social? I don't want to force myself to talk to others. And that's not fair for that person either. I think that's
Of
really.
course. There are no rules. You do you. You take care of yourself. Sometimes we need to fortify ourselves with solitude. Do not confuse solitude with loneliness. Solitude is by choice. Solitude can be restorative. Going for a walk outside in nature can actually boost our spirits. It's been shown scientifically, going outside, hearing the birds, listening to the stream, bubbling by if you live near water. These are restorative. Especially if you're an introvert, this could be really depleting to be in a situation where you're forcing yourself to meet people all the time. Do some and then retreat. Get your stores back engaged, right? Make sure that you are listening to your own energy levels so you can get back out there when you're ready.
Thank you so much. So we do have other questions, but I think time is running out and we have to go back to our very exciting news about the giveaway from Tara.
Yes, Elaine, Allison, I wish we could go on and on this topic. It resonates with our audience. You can tell as the questions started flowing in. I cannot thank you enough. And those of you who are so intrigued by this conversation, I think you would love the book. We have copies of the book. We love it as well. We are going to give some away today. So we have this question. Please share your key takeaways from the session today or how you plan to incorporate what we've learned. Did it really make a difference to you in hearing what we talked about today? We'd love to hear your feedback there, and then we'll put those responses into a drawing and we'll send out 10 copies of this beautiful book. So Allison, thank you for making that happen as well.
I am so thrilled. That's great.
Yes, yes. I also want to share with you, as always, our next steps from here. So we got all of this wonderful information today. What can I do from here? How can I move forward, continue on with this journey? And you can do that right into Thrive. We have logged a lot of resources in there for you. We will upload the recording for you tomorrow. Anyone that missed it, you can point them to this link. It will be dropped in the chat. Some of Allison's resources are in here as well. We have her website, the link to purchase the book, of course, her newsletter, her Instagram. So a lot of great things. Check out that link in the chat. And then also one other thing I wanted to bring your attention to is to register for next month. Next month, we're going to have Nicole Sachs with us. So please join us Tuesday, December 10th, 1 p.m. Eastern. The name of this one is Tapping into the Mind-Body Connection. Nicole is the author of Mind Your Body, and we will dive into the neuroscience behind what keeps us stuck and share these actionable tools and some more micro steps with you to help reclaim your relationship with your body and your overall well-being. So please register for that if you haven't already. We look forward to seeing you. And then to all of you that are here, thank you so much for joining us. And Allison, Elaine, I truly cannot say thank you enough for the conversation that you led us through today. Such a deep and important topic.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alison, and everybody who joined.
All right.
Thanks,
Have a great
guys.
day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.